At 6:30 a.m. on August 17, 1943, the sky over RAF Chelmsford in England carried a cold stillness that seemed to warn of the horror to come. Colonel Curtis LeMay, just 36 years old but already a man hardened by months of unrelenting war, walked the length of the airfield with his usual unreadable expression, watching ground crews give their final checks to 146 B-17 flying fortresses. Engines coughed to life, propellers cut through the fog, and the morning air vibrated with the metallic thunder of war machines preparing for a mission that would either validate American air doctrine or destroy the very foundation of daylight bombing. Their target was Regensburg, deep inside Germany, so deep, in fact, that no escort fighter in existence could fly beside them for even a fraction of the route. The British officers present on the airfield said nothing, but they knew what was coming, for they had lived it. The RAF had tried daylight bombing in the early years of the war, and the Luftwaffe had shredded them ruthlessly, tearing entire formations from the sky with disciplined, coordinated attacks. The Americans, however, believed they were different. They had better aircraft, tighter formations, and the Norden bombsight, technology that they believed could change the war. But the enemy also had something: experience, radar networks, fighter divisions, and the home field advantage that turned every deep raid into a near-suicide mission. LeMay knew all of this, but he also knew that this mission had to happen. Too many political promises had been made. Too many strategic theories rested on the idea that American bombers could fly in daylight without escorts and survive. If this mission failed, daylight precision bombing would be discredited, and the Americans might be forced to adopt British night bombing tactics, a shift that would require months of retraining and the abandonment of years of doctrinal belief. The foundation of this crisis had been laid years earlier, long before the B-17s at Chelmsford were even conceived. In 1939 and 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, the RAF learned in blood that daylight bombing was impossible without fighter protection. On December 14, 1939, a formation of 24 Wellington bombers launched a broad daylight raid against German naval units at Wilhelmshaven. They believed their tight formations and defensive guns would protect them. They were wrong. 12 were ripped from the sky, half the force. 4 days later, another 22 aircraft went out. 12 were shot down. After these disasters and many more like them, the British abandoned daylight raids completely. Their losses were unsustainable, and their aircraft, lighter and more vulnerable than American designs, were no match for German fighters. They shifted to night operations, where darkness offered concealment even if it robbed them of accuracy. But that shift came with a new set of problems. Early in the war, only 1 out of every 3 bombers that claimed to strike its target even came within 5 miles of it. The idea of precision was a fantasy. Crews navigated through darkness, clouds, searchlights, and flak, often unable to see anything until the city beneath them was already burning. This limitation forced the British to embrace a doctrine of area bombing under Air Chief Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris. Harris believed that if factories could not be targeted individually, then the cities that housed them could be annihilated, destroying industrial capacity through terror, fire, and disruption. Cologne, Essen, Hamburg, names that became synonymous with inferno, were bombed mercilessly. Operation Gomorrah in Hamburg killed more than 40,000 people, creating a firestorm so intense that trees were uprooted and people were physically sucked into the flames. Moral debates raged privately, but strategically, the results were undeniable. More than 1 million German workers were forced into reconstruction, thousands of anti-aircraft guns were diverted from the Eastern Front, and German cities buckled under the strain. Yet even with such devastation, the British could not deliver the precise blows needed to cripple Germany's most vital production centers. They could burn a city, yes, but they could not guarantee the destruction of a single ball-bearing plant or aircraft engine factory. It was in this context that the Americans entered the war with a bold, almost stubborn belief in daylight precision bombing. Their faith rested on three pillars: the Norden bomb sight, which promised near-pinpoint accuracy, tight combat box formations that allowed overlapping fields of defensive fire, and heavily armored bombers like the B-17 and B-24, which commanders believed could fight their way through German air defenses without escort fighters. The Norden bomb sight was said to be so accurate that bombardiers could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. Reality, of course, was harsher. Weather, smoke, evasive action, flak bursts, and the sheer difficulty of targeting from high altitude meant that only about one-third of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of their intended target. But this was still better than night bombing, and accuracy was central to American air doctrine. To admit that daylight bombing was impossible would be to admit that years of strategic theory, the very justification for an independent air arm, had been wrong. That was why the Americans continued flying daylight raids even as their losses mounted. From June to August 1943, the survival rate for bomber crews was horrifying. Only 1/4 of the men who began a 25-mission tour were likely to finish it. German fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, attacked in disciplined waves from angles that exploited the weaknesses of American defensive fire. They fired cannon shells that could tear off a wing or rip through a cockpit with a single hit. Bomber crews faced 10 hours of brutal cold in unpressurized aircraft. Oxygen systems froze, electric flight suits failed, guns jammed, and frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and ears. Many who survived the fighters still died from hypoxia or passed out and froze to death at altitude. Worst of all, any bomber that fell out of formation, a straggler, became an easy target for the Luftwaffe. German pilots hunted stragglers with predatory efficiency, calling them the wounded. They would swarm a single aircraft, tear it apart piece by piece, and then move on to the next. The philosophical divide between British and American strategies widened with every mission. British commanders viewed American losses with a mixture of horror and disbelief. They had already proven that daylight raids were impossible without escorts, and they repeatedly argued that American persistence bordered on reckless. The Americans, in turn, believed that the British had given up too easily. They insisted that the B-17 was a different kind of bomber, that their formations were stronger, and that precision bombing, unlike area bombing, could deliver the crippling blows necessary to break the German war machine at its industrial heart. But the truth was cruelly simple. American bombers were dying in daylight just as British aircraft had in 1940. This strategic impasse came to a head at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. There, in a private meeting between Churchill, Roosevelt, and their military chiefs, the future of the entire air war hung in the balance. Churchill, drawing on painful British experience, argued passionately that the Americans should abandon daylight bombing and join the RAF at night. He presented the cold arithmetic: daylight losses were unsustainable. At the rates the 8th Air Force was suffering, 15% losses on deep raids, a bomber group could be annihilated in 7 missions. Even if precision mattered, dead crews could deliver no bombs. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, knew the numbers were against him. The statistical argument favored Churchill entirely. But the political and doctrinal stakes were enormous. If the Americans switched to night bombing, the entire justification for the 8th Air Force, let alone the dream of an independent U.S. Air Force, would collapse. The American strategic bombing doctrine, born at the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama, rested on the idea that precision could change the course of war. The theorists there, Harold George, Haywood Hansel, and others, had spent years studying modern economies. They believed that every industrial system had choke points, critical nodes such as ball bearing factories, aircraft engine plants, synthetic oil facilities, and transportation hubs. Destroying these would cause cascading failures throughout the enemy economy, collapsing production without the need to level entire cities. But such targets could only be hit in daylight. Churchill's argument was simple. Without escorts, daylight was suicide. And the Americans did not yet have escorts with the necessary range. Arnold asked Brigadier General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, to make the counterargument. Eaker had only 24 hours to prepare. When he returned to the conference the next morning, he delivered a memorandum that would alter the course of the war. His first argument was practical. The U.S. had trained its entire bomber force for daylight accuracy. Switching to night bombing would require months of retraining thousands of pilots, navigators, and bombardiers, not to mention redesigning entire operations. During that time, American bombers would be grounded, giving Germany a crucial window to recover, rebuild, and strengthen its industrial base. Second, Eaker argued that alternating bombing, Americans by day, British by night, would create relentless, 24-hour pressure on Germany. Workers would be forced into shelters twice a day. Fire crews, medical units, and anti-aircraft crews would never rest, and the cumulative exhaustion would cripple German productivity. A city bombed at night might still be burning when B-17s arrived the following morning. No industrial economy could endure that indefinitely. His third argument was the most important. Long-range escort fighters were coming. The development of drop tanks, improved engines, and new fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang with the British Merlin engine, meant that within months, American bombers would have the protection they desperately needed. If the Americans gave up daylight bombing now, they would do so just before the cavalry arrived. Finally, Eaker argued that precision bombing was the only way to strike at Germany's true industrial bottlenecks. Area bombing could burn a city, but it could not guarantee the destruction of a specific factory. Only daylight raids could achieve that, and only that would bring Germany's war machine to a halt. Churchill challenged him fiercely. He pointed to the casualty lists, the shattered bomb groups, the mounting losses. He reminded Eaker that Britain had already learned this lesson and that the Americans were simply repeating mistakes from 1940. But Eaker insisted that the Americans needed just 1 year, only one, to prove their doctrine. If daylight bombing with escort fighters failed, he said, the U.S. would reconsider its strategy. Churchill reluctantly agreed. And so, on that August morning at Chelmsford, everything rested on the shoulders of those 146 B-17 crews preparing to fly into Germany without escorts. As LeMay inspected the aircraft, he knew the truth. Many of the men he spoke to would not return. But he also knew that the entire future of strategic bombing, and perhaps the war itself, depended on proving that daylight attacks could work. The engines roared, the formations lifted into the sky, and the mission that would become one of the most brutal in the history of the U.S. 8th Air Force began.